They said the engines couldn't be pushed any harder. That if anyone even touched the regulators again, the whole bomber could explode mid-air. But deep inside a rain-soaked hangar in southern England, one mechanic refused to listen. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't a scientist. He was just a grease-covered man with oil on his hands and fire in his heart. And in a war ruled by rules, he broke the biggest one of all. The year was 1943. Allied bombers were falling out of the sky faster than the factories could build them. The air over Germany had become a slaughterhouse, filled with black smoke, tracer fire, and dying engines. Among those doomed machines was one bomber squadron, known unofficially as the Dead Men's Crew. They flew a heavy four-engine giant called the B-24 Liberator, a plane loved for its range, but cursed for its fragility. Engines overheated. Oil leaks burned through nacelles. Fuel lines froze at altitude. Every flight ended with at least one engine coughing itself to death. For the pilots, it was bad luck. For the ground crews, it was personal failure. And no one took it harder than Sergeant Daniel Cross, a 29-year-old mechanic who'd been fixing engines since before he could drive a car. Daniel had a gift. He could hear an engine's mood just by listening to it idle. Other men used gauges, Daniel used instinct. But by mid-1943, even his instincts couldn't save them. He watched plane after plane limp home, 3 engines dead, the 4th barely breathing. He'd spend sleepless nights inside the hangar, head against the cold aluminum skin, whispering to the machine as if it could understand. And one night, he decided enough was enough. "Sir, it's not the pilots," he told his commanding officer. "It's the damn airflow regulators. They're choking the superchargers." The officer frowned. "You're not cleared to modify them, Sergeant. But if we reroute the mixture valves, we could push." "Sergeant Cross," the man interrupted sharply, "that's forbidden. The manual says." "The manual," Daniel snapped, "was written by men who don't have to fly these coffins." Silence. Then, a quiet warning. "Touch those engines, and you'll face court-martial." Daniel saluted, turned, and walked straight back to the hangar. That night, the rain didn't stop. Lightning rolled across the airfield like artillery flashes. But inside the hangar, the storm was man-made. He stripped the engine down to its bones. Every bolt, every valve, every feed line, until the heart of the bomber lay open before him. He studied the turbosupercharger assembly, a miracle of engineering that boosted air pressure for high-altitude flight. The manuals said it could handle 27 inches of mercury pressure. Daniel wanted 35. It was suicide. The heat alone could melt the turbine blades. But if it worked, the bomber would climb faster, fly higher, and carry twice the bomb load. He worked until dawn, hands bleeding, eyes burning from exhaust fumes. He rerouted the fuel mixture line through an auxiliary bypass valve, adjusting it manually to overfeed the cylinders during climb. He replaced the regulator spring with one from a crashed Spitfire, stronger, tighter, barely fitting. Then he rewired the ignition timing, one circuit at a time, until the bomber's engine was no longer factory issue. It was something else, something wild. When the morning shift came in, the crew froze. The commanding officer stormed in, shouting, "What the hell have you done to my airplane?" Daniel wiped his hands and simply said, "Made it faster." The next test flight was scheduled at noon. No one wanted to fly it. Rumors spread that the engine would explode before takeoff. But one pilot, Lieutenant Ray Carter, volunteered. He had lost half his crew 2 weeks ago, and part of him didn't care anymore. "If it blows," he said, climbing aboard, "at least we'll go out fast." Daniel stood on the tarmac, the wind tearing at his jacket. He could barely breathe as the engines started one by one. First engine, roar. Second, smoother than usual. Third, deep, guttural growl. Fourth, perfect sync. Then came the takeoff. The bomber thundered down the runway, faster than anyone had ever seen. At 1,000 feet, it lifted clean off the ground, no shudder, no sputter, no black smoke. Daniel's hands shook as he watched it climb. 2,000 feet, 5,000, 8,000. Then the radio crackled. "Control, this is Hellhound 1. We're climbing at 3,000 feet per minute. Gasps filled the control room. That was fighter-level performance, impossible for AB-24. And then Carter's voice again, laughing through the static. Tell your mechanic he just built a monster. By the time the bomber landed, word had already spread. Men gathered around the plane like worshippers at an altar. Carter jumped out, grinning ear to ear. She handled like a goddamn fighter. Whatever he did. It works. Daniel didn't smile. He looked at the engines, still glowing faintly from the heat. He knew the risk. One wrong flight, one bad altitude, and they'd melt from the inside out. But it didn't matter. For the first time, a bomber squadron had a machine that could fight back. And by the end of that week, the forbidden modification would change the course of their entire campaign. The base was alive that morning, not with engines or orders, but with whispers. Mechanics from other hangars left their work just to peek at the Liberator that had done the impossible. A heavy bomber that climbed like a fighter, outran flak bursts, and came home without a single engine coughing. The pilots called it the Hellhound. The men who maintained her called it Daniel's Revenge. But the officers had another word for it. Unauthorized. By mid-morning, Sergeant Daniel Cross was summoned to the operations tent. He knew what was coming. 2 military police stood by the door. The squadron commander, Colonel Briggs, didn't look up when Daniel entered. On the desk lay a thick report stamped classified. Sergeant, the colonel said quietly, you've put my entire unit under investigation. Daniel stood silent. The Air Ministry received word of an engine modification that violates standard maintenance protocols, endangering property and personnel. That's sabotage, Cross. He almost laughed, but didn't. With respect, sir, he said. That bomber flew better than any we've got. You saw the data yourself. Briggs's eyes hardened. I also saw the heat readings. That engine ran 20% over redline. If that bird had gone 5 minutes longer, it might have turned into a fireball over the channel. Or, Daniel countered, it might have reached Berlin and come back alive. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Briggs leaned forward. Do you even understand what happens if this spreads? If every grease monkey starts experimenting in his hangar, we'll lose more bombers on the ground than in combat. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. Sir, with respect, we're already losing them. The hearing was postponed, but not cancelled. Daniel was ordered off active maintenance duty, confined to quarters pending review. But war doesn't pause for paperwork. That night, a reconnaissance report came in. New German flak positions near Bremen. The squadron was ordered to strike at dawn. And in the list of assigned aircraft, someone had written, Hellhound, ready. Lieutenant Ray Carter refused to fly without Daniel checking the engines. He's the only one who understands her, Carter said, pointing at the bomber. You ground him, you ground us. The colonel hesitated, then sighed. Fine, you've got 6 hours. But if anything goes wrong, it's on your head. Daniel was back in his element. He ran his fingers across the metal cowling, feeling the heartbeat of the machine beneath. All right, girl, he murmured. Let's see if you're ready to bite again. He retuned the ignition timing, flushed the oil system, and replaced a cracked fuel line. All by instinct, no manual, no permission. The mechanics working beside him watched in silence. For the first time, they weren't seeing a rule breaker. They were seeing a man trying to save lives, one bolt at a time. At 0500 hours, the engines thundered to life again. The sound shook the hangars, sharper, cleaner, more alive than any other bomber on the field. Hellhound, cleared for takeoff, came the voice over the radio. As the bomber rolled down the runway, Daniel stood at the edge, coat flapping in the cold wind. He mouthed a silent prayer. Don't fail me now. Over the North Sea, the formation broke through a ceiling of clouds. Sunlight flashed on aluminum wings. At 15,000 feet, flak bursts started blooming ahead, black flowers in a gray sky. The squadron leader called for evasive action, but Carter's voice cut through the radio chatter. Negative, command. We're pushing straight through. The Hellhounds got power to spare. He pushed the throttles. Engines screamed, but held. The bomber dove rolled and climbed through the storm of metal, outpacing the rest of the formation. A tail gunner later said, "I swear, I saw that Liberator dance through the flak like it was alive." Inside the cockpit, Carter was grinning wildly. "She's still holding, Dan. You crazy bastard. She's still holding." The bombardier released the payload right over target. Direct hits on the munitions plant. Fireballs rose into the sky, painting the clouds orange and black. The crew turned for home, engines still roaring smooth. And for the second time in a week, Hellhound came home without a scratch. But triumph has a price. When they landed, a convoy of staff cars was already waiting on the tarmac. Men in dark uniforms stepped out, not RAF officers this time, but engineers from the Air Ministry. They ordered the plane sealed. The crew was questioned. Daniel was escorted under guard to an interrogation hut. One of the engineers, a gray-haired man with round glasses, walked in carrying a clipboard. "Sergeant Cross," he said politely, "you're either a genius or a lunatic. I haven't decided which yet." Daniel looked him in the eye. "Sir, those engines can take more than the book says. I proved it." The man smiled faintly. "Yes, you also proved you're willing to destroy government property in the process. Do you know how much that supercharger unit costs?" "Less than a crew's lives," Daniel replied. That stopped him. The investigation dragged on for days. Meanwhile, word spread like wildfire through the airbase network. Other mechanics started asking about the cross mod. Rumors said it could make a bomber climb twice as fast, or escape me 109s in a dive. One even claimed a Liberator in the 98th group tried it, and blew both engines on takeoff. Daniel's modification had become legend and dangerous. The officers wanted to bury it. But the pilots? They wanted it in every plane. One evening, as Daniel sat alone outside the barracks, Ray Carter approached with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one over, then sat down beside him. "They're saying command might pull the Hellhound apart," Carter said quietly. "Test the engines. Maybe ground her for good." Daniel nodded slowly. "She's done her job, Ray. If they take her apart, maybe they'll finally see what she's capable of." Carter looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "You know, they'll never put your name on it." Daniel smiled faintly. "I don't need my name on it. I just need our boys to make it home." Weeks passed. The testing teams disassembled the engines piece by piece, documenting every change. They ran the modified supercharger on a stand and watched in disbelief as it produced 15% more boost than standard configuration, without catastrophic failure. Engineers began experimenting with Daniel's design under controlled conditions. They added reinforced bearings, improved cooling, and redesigned the mixture regulators. And soon, a new version of the engine manual was quietly circulated to select bomber groups. It featured a special high-performance mode for emergency climb or escape. The fine print read, "Based on field modifications observed in combat conditions, late 1943. No credit, no name, no mention of the man who started it all." But Daniel didn't care. When he was finally reinstated, he went straight back to the hangar. He didn't look for medals. He didn't ask for promotion. He just went back to his tools, fixing, adjusting, listening. Every time a bomber lifted off the runway with a cleaner roar, he smiled to himself, because he knew. Somewhere out there, hundreds of aircrews were flying home alive, because one man refused to obey the manual. By 1944, the modified supercharger became standard issue on several bomber squadrons. The Hellhound herself survived 12 missions, more than any other plane in her unit. Her engines were eventually retired and sent to a museum. A small, scratched plate was found inside the cowling, welded by hand. It read, "Do not fear the limits, rewrite them." Sergeant D. Crossett began as a whisper, carried across airfields and engine bays from England to Italy. No one knew where it started or who began it. All they knew was that somewhere out there a single bomber had done the impossible. Mechanics called it the cross mod. Pilots called it the Hellhound tune. Command called it unauthorized field innovation. But the men who fought in the skies didn't care what it was called. They only cared that it worked. In the winter of 1944, bomber losses were reaching unbearable levels. Every mission over Germany was a coin toss, half came back, half didn't. Engines overheated, superchargers jammed, fuel systems froze solid mid-flight. And then, out of nowhere, came stories of bombers climbing faster, flying longer, and shrugging off damage that should have sent them spinning into the North Sea. First, nobody believed it, until one B-24 of the 392nd Group, call sign Black Widow, came limping back on 3 engines after a raid on Hamburg. The flight officer who inspected her stared at the gauges in disbelief. All 3 remaining engines had run well above redline, and somehow they'd held. When the crew was questioned, the pilot just grinned. "Some sergeant back in Suffolk showed my mechanic a trick," he said. "Guess you boys can thank him for still having us around." The trick spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before the manuals started disappearing from tool benches, replaced by hand-drawn notes, rough sketches, and whispered instructions. Mechanics scribbled equations on cigarette packs, copied diagrams on scrap metal. Each version slightly different, each one improved by necessity. And though nobody said his name out loud, they all knew where it came from. The man who rewrote the limits. Back at his airfield, Daniel Cross tried to keep his head down. He was back on the roster, back in his hangar, and officially everything was by the book. But every few days letters arrived. Folded notes from other bases, passed along through fuel trucks or mail clerks. Most were unsigned, some barely legible, but they all carried the same message. "Your idea saved us. Engines ran smooth over Frankfurt. Tell your hellhound she's got sisters now." Daniel kept the letters hidden under a loose floorboard in his bunk. He never answered them, but he read every word. Then came the day that changed everything. A coded message arrived from HQ. All maintenance chiefs to report for technical briefing, Operation Eagle Run. The meeting hall at Bassingbourn Airfield was packed. Officers, engineers, and senior mechanics filled every chair. At the front of the room stood a tall, thin colonel with a calm but razor-edged tone. "Gentlemen," he began, "we're here because something extraordinary and dangerous is happening in our own units." He clicked a slide projector. Photos of disassembled engines filled the screen. "These superchargers have been modified," he continued, "illegally, and yet, somehow they're outperforming regulation equipment." A murmur ran through the crowd. "Whoever started this," the colonel said, "is either a saboteur or a savior." Daniel sat quietly in the back, eyes fixed on the floor. The colonel went on, showing graphs of engine efficiency, altitude gain, and reduced fuel loss. Even the skeptics in the room couldn't deny the results. Finally, the colonel sighed. "Command can't officially endorse these modifications, but we can't ignore them either." Then he said something no one expected. "As of today, a technical division will be formed to evaluate and replicate the so-called field improvements, effective immediately." A new name was given to the effort, Project Skyfire. A week later, Daniel was ordered to London. He arrived at an underground research facility, its walls echoing with the sound of typewriters and turbine tests. Scientists in white coats, engineers from Rolls-Royce and Pratt & Whitney, all working side by side. A general greeted him with a handshake. "Sergeant Cross," he said, "you're not in trouble. You're being drafted into science." Daniel looked around, half in awe, half in disbelief. He'd gone from turning wrenches in the mud to standing beside some of the smartest men in the world. On a workbench lay a cutaway version of his modified supercharger, meticulously recreated from his notes and reverse-engineered engines. The chief engineer turned to him. "We couldn't figure out how you prevented thermal runaway at those boost pressures," he said, "until we found this." He held up a tiny component, a handmade spacer, filed from scrap aluminum, no bigger than a coin. "You changed the airflow geometry with this piece. Crude, but brilliant." Daniel smiled faintly. "It wasn't meant to last forever," he said, "just long enough to bring the boys home." For the next 3 months, Daniel worked side by side with engineers to refine the design. They reinforced the housing, improved oil circulation, and added an automatic cutoff to prevent overheating. The final product, the Skyfire turbo assembly, increased high-altitude performance by 18% and engine lifespan by 40%. By mid-1944, it was being installed in every new B-24 leaving American factories. The Air Corps never publicized the reason, but the crews knew. They said the new engines sounded different, like they had a growl under the hum, like they wanted to fight. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the difference was staggering. Over Berlin, pilots reported climbing faster than interceptors. Over Cologne, entire squadrons made it home with engines still purring like new. The Luftwaffe couldn't understand how the same bombers they'd once shredded were now outrunning their fighters. German engineers captured wrecks and tore them apart. But the changes were subtle, nearly invisible. All they knew was that somehow, America's bombers had become unstoppable. In a secret memo, intercepted years later, one German officer wrote, "It seems the Americans have discovered a way to give their machines souls." He wasn't wrong, because for men like Daniel, those bombers were alive, every bolt and piston beating like a heart. But not everyone celebrated. One night, Daniel was called to the colonel's office at the research base. He found a man in a dark suit waiting for him, no insignia, no name tag. "Sergeant Cross," the man said. "You've done remarkable work, but from here on, your contribution must remain confidential." Daniel frowned. "Why?" "Because heroes complicate history," the man said flatly. "Machines win wars, not men." He handed Daniel a document marked Official Secrets Act. "Sign this and you can go home. Don't sign it, and you'll never see a hangar again." Daniel looked at the paper for a long time. Then, quietly, he signed. When he returned to his base weeks later, everything had changed. The hangars buzzed with new engines, new parts, new life. Mechanics worked with pride. Pilots joked about crossfire mode. But Daniel stayed silent. He knew the truth, and that was enough. Every takeoff, every mission report that said all crews returned safely, felt like a medal no one could pin. Then came Operation Firestorm, the largest air assault on Germany yet. Thousands of bombers, armed with the new Skyfire engines, rose into the dawn sky. Daniel stood on the tarmac, watching wave after wave vanish into the clouds. He didn't say a word, just listened. The sound of those engines filled the air, deep and smooth, the sound of his creation living and breathing. And for a brief moment he allowed himself to smile, because this time the sky belonged to them. When the reports came back, the numbers were staggering. Losses had dropped by nearly 30%. Fuel efficiency was up, and performance at high altitude exceeded every expectation. The Air Corps Command issued a statement. "Recent technological improvements have increased mission survivability. Our mechanics are the unsung heroes of this war." Daniel read those words quietly. No name, no credit, just a single anonymous acknowledgement. And that was enough. But deep down he knew something else. The war was changing. Technology had become the new battlefield and innovation the new weapon. He'd learned that sometimes defiance wasn't rebellion. Sometimes it was survival. And though history would never mention Sergeant Daniel Cross, the men who flew with his engines would remember him in every heartbeat of metal. Every time a bomber broke through the clouds, every time an engine refused to quit, they'd hear his voice echo in the roar of the turbines. "Don't fear the limits. Rewrite them." The war ended the way all storms do. Not with a roar, but with silence. In 1945, the skies over Europe grew quiet. The thunder of engines faded, the smoke cleared, and the world began to count the cost of what it had done. Airfields that once buzzed with life turned into graveyards of metal. Engines were shut down, planes parked in rows stretching to the horizon, wings covered in dust, waiting to be scrapped. And somewhere among them, Sergeant Daniel Cross walked alone. The day he left his base, the sky was gray, calm, indifferent. He packed his tools, his uniform, and one small box of notes. Inside were the sketches and formulas that had changed everything. No medals, no citations, just grease-stained pages, written by a man who'd refused to follow the rules. He left the hangar door open as he walked away, like a final salute to the ghosts inside. Back home in Illinois, Daniel tried to live a normal life. He took a job at a small machine shop, fixing tractors instead of bombers. The sound of pistons and oil never left him. It was the rhythm of his soul. Sometimes, kids from the neighborhood would gather to watch him work. He'd show them how to tune a carburetor, how to listen for misfires. "Engines talk," he'd say. "You just have to learn their language." They didn't understand what he meant. Not really. But they loved the way he spoke about machines like they were alive. Years passed. The world moved on. New wars came, new machines rose. Faster, deadlier, powered by jet engines instead of pistons. But every time Daniel saw one streak across the sky, he felt a quiet pride. Because deep down, he knew the jet age hadn't begun in a laboratory. It had begun in a cold hangar in Suffolk, with a stubborn mechanic who refused to listen to no. In 1958, while cleaning out his workshop, Daniel came across the box again. He opened it and for the first time in years reread his notes. The ink had faded, the paper yellowed, but the words still carried weight. Increase airflow, reroute pressure, don't let fear dictate the limits. He smiled faintly. The world would never know that those notes had once saved hundreds of men. Or maybe it already did, just not by name. A few years later, a journalist from a small aviation magazine visited his town. He was writing a feature on wartime innovations, the unknown engineers of World War II. Someone had told him about an old mechanic who'd done something strange with engines during the war. Daniel almost laughed when the reporter knocked on his door. He listened politely, offered coffee, and let the man talk. When asked about the cross mod, Daniel just shook his head. "I don't know about any of that," he said softly. "I just fixed what was broken." The reporter left with nothing. No story, no quote, no confession. Daniel preferred it that way, because heroes don't always live in headlines. Sometimes they live in silence. Decades passed. The Cold War came and went. Planes that once shook the earth were now museum pieces, their engines polished and lifeless behind ropes and glass. And Daniel Cross, the man who'd once defied the manuals of the United States Army Air Corps, grew old. His hands trembled now, too weak to hold a wrench. But when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the roar of the B-24s, the song of turbines over the North Sea. He could still see the boys, the pilots and gunners who'd trusted him with their lives. Some had made it home, some hadn't. Each face was a story he'd never forget. One winter evening, as snow fell outside his workshop, Daniel sat in his old chair beside the furnace. On the table lay that same box, open again. Inside, alongside the letters he'd once hidden under his bunk, was something new, a newspaper clipping sent by a friend. The headline read, "Declassified, Project Skyfire, the secret that saved the bombers." Daniel's hands shook as he read. The article described the mysterious modification that had boosted the performance of Allied aircraft in 1944. A modification never officially acknowledged, but now finally confirmed through declassified documents. It spoke of an unnamed field mechanic whose notes led to the redesign of Allied superchargers. An act of defiance turned into engineering history. Daniel smiled quietly. The world had finally found out, just not his name, and that somehow felt perfect. That night, he wrote a single note and tucked it inside the box before closing it for the last time. "If you ever open this, know this: machines can't feel fear, but men can. The trick is to make something that reminds them to keep going anyway." D.C. When Daniel passed away in 1971, the local paper wrote a small obituary. Daniel Cross, mechanic and veteran, known for his kindness and skill with engines, survived by his wife and daughter. No mention of history, no medals, just a quiet goodbye. His daughter kept the box, unsure what it meant, until years later when her own son grew up to study aerospace engineering. In 1993, that grandson, Michael Cross, stood inside the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, staring at a B-24 bomber suspended above the floor. He read the plaque beneath it, tracing the words with his finger. Equipped with advanced turbo supercharger system, derived from field modifications tested in 1944. A familiar tingle ran down his spine. He'd seen those diagrams before. They were in his grandfather's notebook. He went home, opened the old box, and realized what he was holding: the original blueprints of the Skyfire modification. A story buried by time, waiting to be rediscovered. That year, Michael submitted the documents to the museum's research department. Months later, he received a letter in return. After reviewing your materials and cross-referencing wartime records, we can confirm that your grandfather's work directly contributed to Project Skyfire. His innovation increased the survival rate of Allied bomber crews and influenced later turbocharger designs. We intend to include his name in our upcoming exhibit on unsung wartime engineers. Michael read the letter 3 times before finally whispering, "Grandpa, they know." In 1995, at a small ceremony in Washington, D.C., a new plaque was unveiled in the Innovations of World War II exhibit. It read, Daniel Cross, 1916 to 1971, United States Army Air Corps, field mechanic. Developed the original airflow and pressure modulation system later known as the Skyfire turbo assembly. His unauthorized innovation enhanced engine reliability and helped countless crews return home safely. He didn't break the rules. He rewrote them. Crowds passed by, reading the name, most never realizing what it truly meant. But one young visitor, standing beneath the bomber's shadow, whispered quietly, "Thank you." Maybe he didn't know who he was thanking, but somehow the air itself seemed to hum, like the engine still remembered. Epilogue: The Sound of Forever. Outside the museum, a vintage B-24 engine was started for demonstration. It rumbled to life, smooth and steady, a deep, powerful growl that echoed across the tarmac. Michael closed his eyes. For a moment, it sounded just like the stories his grandfather used to tell. That same growl that once carried men through hell and back. That same heartbeat of steel and courage. And as the engine thundered to full power, the air seemed to whisper the words Daniel Cross had lived by. The words that changed everything. Don't fear the limits. Rewrite them.